All right. I think you can hear the fan for the computer. That makes it a little better. Okay. So, welcome back to another reading of Under the Oak Tree by Suji Kim, Volume 1. We're going to go ahead and we're going to start with the message, the little note by Suji Kim in the beginning, like we always do. And this will be Chapter 6. A note from Suji Kim. To my readers, this story grapples with many difficult and complex themes. The content includes depictions of physical and mental abuse, as well as themes of trauma and emotional distress experienced by the characters. Certain scenes may be disturbing and triggering for some readers. Reader discretion is advised. The story also contains explicit sexual content that may not be suitable for all audiences. Please approach this content with care and seek support if needed. For any readers who see themselves in this tale, my hope is that it provides you with the comfort, courage, and the knowledge that you are not alone. All right. Gonna go ahead and start Chapter 6. The refurbishments proceeded smoothly. In place of crude flagstones, gleaming marble tiles covered the floor of the banquet hall, and each of the old shutters framing the windows, which creaked in the slightest breeze, were replaced with smoothly oiled mahogany. As Ruth had suggested, panes of the high-quality crystal glass were installed only in the banquet hall, great hall, 8 of the largest guest rooms, and Maxi's bedchamber. The windows in the library, barracks, and dining hall were set instead with standard bulk glass. The remaining chambers and corridors were fitted with new greased parchment windows, complete with shutters. These small changes were enough to brighten the gloomy castle, and the servants seemed pleased with the transformation. They worked with cheerful faces, though the maids did have to work twice as hard to clean in wake of the construction. Have you seen the new furniture? It's magnificent. And the curtains are beautiful too. I can't wait to see the chandelier. We'll soon have the most splendid banquet hall in all of Wedham. The Great Hall finally lives up to its name. I heard that once the windows are complete, they'll bring in new carpets for the floor. 3 young maidservants carrying baskets full of laundry chatted animatedly. Their cheeks flushed. Recognizing them as the new hires Aderon has recommended, Maxi paused in her hurried strides through the corridor. I'm certain the Lord will be surprised when he returns, said one of the maids excitedly. He most definitely will be. I heard he was furious at the state of the castle when he returned from his last campaign. The maidservant's words made Maxi's heart flutter in anticipation. Would Riftan really be pleased by the changes, or would he perhaps think them too extravagant? She quickly cast off her worries before they could consume her. Ruth had assured her that the renovations were acceptable, though he did seem a little bothered by the expense. Shaking off her anxiety, Maxi continued on her way downstairs to oversee the preparations for the winter. In Riftan's absence, it fell to her to ensure that there were sufficient reserves of food and water for the servants, guards, and horses, as well as firewood and warm clothing for the coming months. Milady, the new wall lamps and braziers have arrived. Rodrigo bowed his head to her as he and a few other servants carried wooden crates inside. Would you like to see them? Maxi nodded, and Rodrigo set the crates down so he could pry the one open with an iron poker. Inside rested 9 elegant wall lamps. There are 15 crates in total, my lady. But please make sure that the rest of the lamps are in good condition. I want them placed in the great hall, the banquet hall, and the corridors. And the braziers? Please put 2 in the kitchen. The rest can go in the barracks, and the guardhouse. As you wish, my lady. One by one, the servants carried the crates across the great hall, and Maxi turned on her heel to exit. Winter was fast approaching, and the air had turned sharp with cold. Maxi's breath puffed in front of her lips as she made for the stables with quick, light steps. She planned to visit the stable, annex, and forge to decide whether anything else needed to be purchased. While leafing through old ledgers earlier in the day, she had discovered that her predecessors had made annual inspections of the castle. Her focus on the renovations had caused her to neglect other areas of the castle. The path led her around the garden to the southern end of the grounds, where the stables were located. Surprised by her presence, the stable hands dropped the fodder they had been transporting and hurriedly took off their hats. "My lady, what brings you here?" Quinnell Osborne, the stable master, came out to meet her. "Were there no maidservants to accompany you?" Maxi recognized him from her first day at Calypse Castle, and she took a deep breath, hoping to speak calmly. "They had their own duties to attend to, so I came to see if there's anything you need for the winter, since merchants will be less inclined to travel when the days grow colder." "Oh, thank you, my lady." Quinnell's face brightened. "I was about to go meet with Rodrigo for that very purpose." He swung open the stable door and held up a lamp for her. The interior looked as though it had just been cleaned. Grimacing slightly at the stench, Maxi leaned forward without stepping inside, her eyes skimming over the 20 war horses that were snorting and grazing on hay. Quinnell pointed to the end of the room where one stall appeared to be on the verge of collapsing. "See there, milady, we'll need new partitions, but our tools are old and we don't have enough wood since all of the suitable trees have been cleared." Is there anything else?" "We'll also need more hay to last us the winter, milady." Very well, I'll put it in order." "Bless you, milady. Thank you kindly," the old man grinned. Maxi smiled in response, letting out a breath of relief. Not long after, the mere presence of other people had been enough to make her tremble in fear, but now she was able to look them in the eyes while keeping her composure. Though her tongue still refused to move as she willed, her stutter had improved a little, owing to the fact that she had far more opportunities to speak here than at Croyso Castle. Proud of her progress, Maxi left the stables and stepped back into the spacious garden. The high walls cast frigid shadows over her, and she wrapped her shawl around her shoulders more tightly. The breeze carried the scent of grass, and loose strands of her hair danced in its wake, tickling her face. She brushed them away absent-mindedly, only to stop in her tracks when she suddenly recalled Riftan liking the voluminous hair to cotton clouds. Looking up, her eyes fell upon the distant mountains that Riftan had traversed to reach the capital. He should have arrived in Drakium by now. She pictured the royal capital bustling with lively festivities. Riftan, clad in silver armor, would stand tall and gallant before the nobles like a hero out of a legend, and none would dare look down on him for his humble background anymore. Even the noblewoman who had once shunned him would fall for him. Maxi's heart plummeted at the thought, and her stomach began to turn as she imagined Riftan surrounded by poised and beautiful ladies in the ballroom of the royal palace. Basking in their admiration, Riftan would regret marrying her. He would realize his mistake and finally divorce her. "What are you doing here all alone, my lady?" The voice snapped Maxi out of her unpleasant reverie. She whirled around to see two youths in black tunics watching her with puzzled expressions. Recognizing them as two of the squires she had seen at the banquet, she straightened up. The youths greeted her with their hands on their chest and bowed respectfully. "No need to be alarmed, my lady," one said. He was the handsome, silver-haired squire who had been eager for stories of Riftan's adventures. "We just wanted to make sure that you were all right." I am, thank you. Unsure of what to call the squire, Maxi fell silent. "Please pardon my late introduction, milady," he said quickly. "I am Elysian Rovar. I will be knighted next year." The taller youth standing awkwardly next to him followed suit. Garo Livakion, my lady. I am to be knighted on the same day as my friend here. I am Maximilian Calypse. As soon as she said it, her expression became sheepish, feeling silly at having introduced herself when clearly already know her. Ulyssean, however, flashed her a reassuring smile. Were you taking a stroll, my lady? No, I was just inspecting the castle. Ulyssean's face turned serious. We may be inside the safety of the castle walls, but you still shouldn't wander on your own for too long, my lady. We've had more visitors lately, and if an accident were to occur... An accident? Her voice wavered, which in turn sent Ulyssean into a fluster. Apologies. It was not my intention to scare you. I was just concerned is all. He trailed off, rubbing the back of his neck uncertainly before brightening again. Would you perhaps allow me to escort you, my lady? It's all right. I don't want you to waste your time. It is an honor for a knight to serve a lady, and though I may not be one yet, I'm fully prepared to protect you with my life. His fervor took Maxi by surprise, causing her to step back. Garo elbowed him in the ribs. Stop exaggerating, Yuli. I assure you, I mean every word. Ulyssean's eyes flashed with fiery determination, but only for a moment. The sound of his own shout echoing through the courtyard seemed to help him realize that he was getting carried away, and he cleared his throat before addressing Maxi in a calmer voice. In any case, you mustn't walk around by yourself. If you like, I can send for some of the guards to escort you. I'm just taking a walk, Maxi said. There's no need to go that far. These walls do not guarantee safety, my lady. If anything were to happen to you, I would never be able to face Lord Calypse. Ulyssean blanched at his own words, shaken by the thought alone. If this worries you so, then I suppose I could use an escort. The squire's face lit up at her assent. Where shall I escort you, my lady? I was on my way to the forge. What a coincidence! That's where we were headed as well. Please allow me to lead the way. Ulyssean took the lead with a spring in his step, and Garo shrugged before falling into step beside him. After hesitating for just a moment longer, Maxi followed after them. Ulyssean's attention had a refreshing warmth to it. Though Riftan was caring, his mannerisms were brusque, to say the least, and Ruth was not one to mince his words either. When it came to the rest of the knights, they simply ignored Maxi's existence entirely. These squires must be 15 years old, 16 at most. Ulyssean glanced over his shoulder at her curiously. Do you have some special business in the forge? Nothing in particular, but I wanted to see if they needed anything or ordered before winter sets in. Ah, I see. Garo and I were on our way there because my sword broke during training. Ulyssean remained cheerful as he pointed at the sword strapped to his belt. It's embarrassing to admit, but this is the second time it's happened this month. The blacksmith scolds me whenever he sees me. He blushed slightly at his own confession, but Maxi smiled at his candor. Though his eagerness to please made her a little uncomfortable, she could see that he was a kind and sincere young man. At this rate, I'll never become a tenth of the knight Sir Riftan is. I couldn't even fill the toes of his boots. We'll be Ren-Dragon knights next year, Yuli, Garo said in a mollifying tone. Comparing yourself to him is a little unproductive, don't you think? You only say that because you don't understand how incredible Sir Riftan is, Garo. Never mind 1/10. Becoming even 100th of the knight he is would be an achievement all on its own. Is that right? Garo's tone was unimpressed. He clearly had enough of his companion's hero worship. Maxi, however, looked pleased. Is Riftan really so accomplished a knight? Accomplished doesn't even begin to describe him. Ulyssean gawked at her, incredulous. Sir Riftan is the greatest knight of our era. He isn't called Uyghur's reincarnation for nothing. Only 5 knights on the continent have received that honor, and he's defeated 2 of them. First, it was Sir Sigilio Aran of Libidon during a sword-fighting tourney 6 years ago, and he just recently bested Sir Quahel Leon of Osiria. Maxi smiled again, though it carried a hint of uncertainty. She had heard the name of the Temple Knight's commander on several occasions, but she had no sense of his greater renown. Almost as if he was unsatisfied with her response, Ulysses continued in a more enthusiastic tone. I decided to become a knight after seeing Sir Riftan's swordsmanship in a competition. I've admired him ever since. I see. Maxi nodded tentatively, unsure of what kind of response he expected from her. Ulysses frowned at her lukewarm reaction. It seems you're unfamiliar with your husband's eminence, milady. That's not true. I know of how he felled the dragon. He was a remarkable knight well before the dragon campaign. Have you ever seen him wield a sword, milady? Of course I have. I watched him fight off monsters in the past. But even as the words left her lips, she was unsure that she could truly claim to have seen anything. The first time she had fainted, and the second time the battle was over before she even realized what had transpired. Reluctant to give the impression that she knew next to nothing about her own husband, Maxi filled the gaps in her memory with embellishments. In fact, I saw Riftan cut a full-grown giant in half with my own eyes. 10 of them attacked us, and they were slain before I could blink. In truth, she could not remember how many monsters there had been, but she stubbornly maintained her pretense, certain that there could have been no fewer than 10. Her recounting earned her the awe of both squires, and their eyes sparkled with intrigue. 10 giants? Did he really? Incredible! Tell us more! Maxi flinched. She could easily tell from the squires' eager faces that they expected an epic tale. But she had already set their expectations too high to admit the truth now. Desperately, she racked her brain for details from heroic ballads she heard from bards in the past. We were in the carriage when we heard a ferocious roar. It was terribly loud, loud enough to tear the sky asunder. I thought the very sky had come crashing down, but while I stood paralyzed, Riftan leaped off the carriage, sword in hand. He moved so fast that I didn't have a chance to see him draw it. No one can draw faster than Sir Riftan. Ulysses took a step forward, eyes wide. His enemies bleed from their necks before they've even noticed the glint of his blade. To be honest, it was a bit unsettling to her that the youths were so delighted by the nightmarish scene, but she carried on. There were 10 giants as tall as the castle walls. All of the knights drew their blades then, and they charged with Riftan, leading the attack. He swung his sword at the biggest of the monsters with a flash of light. She squinted, trying to remember how Ulysses put it just a moment ago. The beast's head rolled onto the ground, blood spurting from its neck. Of course, Sir Riftan's blade can slice through dragon's breath, Ulysses grinned. A mere giant is nothing. With bated breath, the squires waited for her to continue, showing no sign of frustration with her stuttering. Their zeal fueled her own excitement, and she held her arms out in front of her, swinging an imaginary sword. Seeing its kin slain, another giant let out a defeating roar. It swung its club at Riftan. It was as thick as a tree, but Riftan dodged it by jumping high into the air like an eagle taking flight. She smiled inwardly, commending her own choice of words. The giant was too slow to react, and it struck the ground where Riftan stood just a moment before. The very earth shook beneath the blow. She swung her arms downward, pretending to strike the ground, and the squires tensed their shoulders in suspense. Their anticipation made Maxi grow more and more elated. No one had ever been so engrossed by her words before. Riftan's sword flashed again, and a split second later, the ogre's arm dropped to the ground, sliced clean off, and the mere mention of blood made the squires lean in closer with renowned excitement. And so she raised her arms and began to shout dramatically. It poured down as the giant shook its severed stump. A rain of black blood. Indeed, and it took us half a day just to wash it all off of us. Maxi's heart skipped a beat and she froze. Arms still held above her head, Ruth crouched under a tree just ahead of them, scraping moss from between its roots. With a soft grunt, he stood up with a sack in hand and continued. Everyone's armor and clothes were stained black that day. I nearly thought we'd have to change the name of our order from the Rum Dragon Knights to the Black Dragon Knights, because there was nothing white about our clothing that day. Mage Ruth! Ulysses eagerly hurried towards the sorcerer. What are you doing here? I'm gathering a reagent for the trees on her ladyship's request. Ruth lifted the sack slightly. But did I interrupt something? It seems she was in the middle of recounting our fierce battle against the ogres. Maxi blushed from head to toe, wishing she could crumble into dust and be blown away by the wind. Ruth, who had seen her vomit and faint at the sight of blood, could call her bluff if he so wished. The squires, however, seemed wholly oblivious to her mortification and continued to chatter away. Yes, we were just at the part where Sir Riftan felled 10 of those giants in the blink of an eye. 10, you say? Ruth spoke in a slow drawl, feigning interest. Maxi's heart pounded and her eyes darted from side to side as she tried to think of some way to excuse herself before Ruth exposed her lie. But Ruth did not expose her. Instead, he cast her a knowing look before carrying on with a straight face. If that's enough to impress you, then I suppose her ladyship hadn't told you about the battle in the mountains. Battle in the mountains? Oh, yes. We were crossing Anatolium when a pack of werewolves tried to ambush us, but he tapped his lips thoroughly. My memory fails me, milady. My memory fails me, Lady Calypse. How many of those beasts were there? I don't remember. Well, there were simply too many to count. The horde had enough fur to carpet the whole mountain. That many? Ulysses gaped. In Anatolium? Maxi stood paralyzed, cold sweat beading on the back of her neck. Ruth smirked. I think her ladyship is better equipped to regale you with the finer details. The two youths looked to her expectantly, but Maxi's face was now flushed crimson. She might have gotten a bit overzealous in her storytelling moments ago, but to concoct such bold-faced lies in front of Ruth, she did not have the nerve. Thankfully, Ruth seemed to take pity on her and came to the rescue. But I'm sure her ladyship has many other affairs that require her attention. We mustn't take so much of her time. Yes, I do have some matters to attend to. Maxi hastily went along with his excuse, but as she turned to leave, Ruth stopped her. I have a message for you, my lady. Your tale was so enthralling that it almost slipped my mind. A message? She narrowed her eyes skeptically, half expecting him to start mocking her. Ruth, however, simply pulled out a small piece of parchment, unfolding it before handing it to her. This is a letter from Sir Riftan. He plans to leave the capital as soon as the victory celebration is over. The journey will take a fortnight at most, but at their pace, I expect his arrival in 10 days' time. Maxi's embarrassment melted away at the unexpected news. Beaming, she took the slip of paper from him to read it herself, noting Riftan's date of departure and planned travel route. Ruth shook his head and sighed. He really doesn't want to stay a second longer than necessary. Is that a problem? It wouldn't hurt to let King Reuben save face by staying at court a little longer. Ulysses quickly came to his idol's defense. With werewolves roaming the border of Anatole, I'm sure Sir Riftan is only concerned about our security. I can only imagine how worried he must be. Wishing to avoid this uncomfortable change in topic, Maxi brought the conversation to an end. Thank you for telling me, Ruth. I really must be going now. Of course, my lady. I am very well aware of how busy you are. Ruth's acerbic comment echoed behind her as she scurried off. The lightness of her feet surprised her. Despite being almost humiliated moments ago, she was in relatively high spirits. She resisted the urge to hum a tune, conscious of the young squires following behind her. After completing her inspection of the castle, Maxi returned to her room to organize her list of requisitions. As soon as she awoke the next morning, she rushed to the library to ask Ruth to check her work for errors, only to find the sorcerer fast asleep on the threadbare carpet with books piled atop his body in place of a blanket. He scowled when she woke him, but ultimately relented and scanned the list without a word of complaint, using an ink-dipped quill to cross out a few items and adjust certain quantities. The steward has more than enough fuel for lanterns stocked, candles as well. We also have plenty of spare tableware in storage. And pray tell, my lady, who will be using all of this soap and scented oil? The knights seemed to enjoy baths and saunas. Ha! Do you honestly expect those men to use such things? They'll scowl if you so much as hold anything with a vaguely floral scent under their noses. Only order enough for yourself. He promptly crossed out the unnecessary items with a flourish, as if he was doing her a great favor, and continued to scan the list. The rest seems fine. Then should I put in the order? Let me add a few items first. Maxi's eyes widened at his request. It was the first time Ruth had suggested spending more money. Curious, she peered down at the words he was scratching onto the parchment. It appeared to be a long series of names. Seeing him add people to her list of purchases made her assume the worst, and she gaped at him. He was not asking her to buy slaves, was he? What are those? Names of scholars. I'd like you to order anything and everything the merchants can find that was written by them. Maxi stared at him blankly for a few seconds. You're asking me to buy personal items using the castle treasury? Expensive and extravagant items at that. My lady, knowledge is valuable beyond all measure. Ruth's demeanor transformed into solemnity. I assure you, these books are not for my personal benefit. They're for the library. Anyone would be free to come and read them. Her jaw dropped at his brazenness. Ruth detested seeing others in the library. He made no attempt to hide his displeasure when even she, the lady of the castle, entered. In fact, he had practically claimed the library as his territory in addition to his tower. I've never seen anyone but yourself using the library. I'm sure more people will use it in the future. He gave a pragmatic shrug. Maxi regarded him doubtfully. The majority of the castle's inhabitants were knights who spent their days training outside, only returning to eat or sleep. For all his uncompromising interference with her purchases, Ruth seemed to have no qualms when it came to buying the things that he wanted. Narrowing her eyes, Maxi snatched the quill from his hand and crossed out his additions. Startled and rather indignant, Ruth snatched the parchment back. I am the resident sorcerer of this castle. Cultivating my talents is for the good of Anatole. I knew it. You're ordering these books for yourself, and these books aren't even about magic. Oh, really? And how would you know that, milady? I've spent 22 years in a library. Even I know the names of philosophers like Gerald or Kazaham. The arrogance within his blue-gray eyes wavered, a clear sign that she was right. The books had nothing to do with magic in the slightest. She smiled triumphantly. Give me that list. You told me yourself that we need to fund road construction next year. We can't afford all of these books. Milady, Ruth cried, a hint of desperation seeping into his voice. Aren't you worried that your future child will grow up to be nothing but a sword-swinging fool? It was Maxi's turn to be shaken. Her face burned as she thought someone had poured scalding water over her. She could almost feel steam rising from her head. Child? What on earth are you talking about? Your child, the next natural undertaking between a man and his wife? And unless Sir Riftan leaves for yet another campaign, I'll suspect it'll be a year or two at most before we hear the first cries of an infant in this castle. Infant? The rising heat was pricking at her eyes now. Bringing her hands up, she tried to cool her burning cheeks with her palms. Heart racing at the thought of holding a baby in her arms, as she fidgeted, flustered, Ruth grabbed her hands. Surely you want your child to grow to be well-learned, sensible, clever, but the child hasn't even been born. It'll be too late by then. Children need knowledge to grow, and it's your responsibility to prepare a good environment for them in advance. It was all too much too soon, and suggested so suddenly. Overwhelmed by the sorcerer's insistence, Maxi could not find it in herself to protest. She had no time to gather herself before Ruth took advantage of her distracted state, swiping the quill from her and penning in his list of authors once again. There, he nodded with approval at the names. All done. After filling nearly 5 entire lines with his requests, he returned the parchment to Maxi with a satisfied look, unbothered by her reluctance as she looked it over. What if Riftan gets mad because we bought too many books? Sir Riftan wouldn't concern himself with such paltry sums as these, truly. Maxi stared at him, at a loss for words. She did not consider herself a worldly woman by any means, but even she knew that books were extremely costly, more so than glass. Producing a book required tremendous effort and time. Each line was inscribed letter by letter, and meticulous needlework bound the pages to gilded leather covers. Even her father had kept certain books on a display shelf to keep them in pristine condition. The academic tomes Ruth sought were handwritten by a handful of scholars. As such, they were not nearly as easy to locate as novels of prose or poetry, derived from the bard's songs and stories. On the rare occasion that the manuscripts could be found, they were prohibitively expensive. You were the one who said we must cut spending. Knowledge is more precious than gold, my lady. As Ruth plunked himself down in his usual seat, the impact caused the tower of books around him to collapse. Volumes that purportedly contained invaluable knowledge were scattered across the floor. Maxi scowled at the sight, wondering whether she should make a caustic remark, but she decided against it with a heavy sigh. All things considered, Ruth had been of great help. After everything he had done for her, she could not afford to antagonize him. I'll put in the order for the books. Thank you, Ruth said crisply before returning to his book. Maxi left the library shaking her head. The hallway beyond were illuminated by the sunlight pouring in through the newly installed windows. She kept her gaze fixed on the cloudless blue sky before descending the stairs with light steps. Elegantly carved railings lined either side of the stairs, the steps of which were now covered by a soft carpet. Though Maxi had initially panicked when she was tasked with redecorating the castle, her heart swelled with pride now that she saw the small changes her effort had made. She smiled broadly as she entered the banquet hall, where Rodrigo was busy supervising the final phase of construction. "Rodrigo, are you busy?" "My lady." Rodrigo's wrinkled face brightened when he saw her. Maxi handed him the handwritten requisition list. "I went around the castle to check if there's anything else we may need. Can I trouble you to order these items?" Of course, milady. And please ask the merchants to find the books authored by the scholars listed at the bottom." "As you wish." The steward folded the parchment neatly and put it in his inner pocket. Maxi smiled again, satisfied to have completed one of her tasks. But as she turned around to leave, Rodrigo stopped her. "The young squires caught 4 ochre in the mountain stream at dawn, milady. They'll soon be ready if you'd like to head down to the kitchen." Ochre? Fish. They live in fresh mountain streams, which gives them their soft, rich texture. There's nothing as delicious as freshly caught ochre grilled over charcoal. His description alone was enough to make her mouth water. Though the meals at Calyp's castle were always delicious, they were meat-heavy. Despite Anatol's vast coastline and numerous lakes and rivers, Maxi had never seen seafood on the table. Her stomach growled at the prospect of sinking her teeth into freshly grilled fish. But the squires caught those. It would be presumptuous of me to. They say they caught them for you, my lady. They'll be thrilled if you join them. Maxi nodded, though not without a slight blush, and rushed out of the banquet hall. Her eagerness to try the delicacy only grew as she made her way to the kitchen. When she poked her head inside, she found Ulysses and Garrow filleting 4 fish on skewers above the drain, each ochre the length of a grown man's arm. Next to the squires, the cook looked on anxiously, sweating profusely. "Young masters, please allow me. I insist." It's fine. Ulysses waved him off dismissively, his light tone entirely at odds with the carnage in his hands. "We need to learn how to cut into creatures like these. After all, consider it a part of our training." Beside him, Garrow collected the blood in a bucket held beneath the fish's severed tail. "Yuli, I'm finished bleeding this one out." "Give it here. I'll carve that one too." The cook blanched. "Please, let me. I can't let you do such lowly work." "Oh, hush," said Ulysses. "As I said, this is part of our training." "That's right, and besides, this fish is going on the ladies' table. We are determined to prepare them ourselves." Garrow's brow furrowed as he spoke, and he added, "But why did we catch fish of all things? A fox or a stag would have made a better gift." "Garrow, how could you even think of hurting such magnificent creatures?" Ulysses looked horrified at the suggestion. Garrow gestured to the fish. "Are you saying these fish met untimely death simply because they're ugly?" "They had the misfortune of being ugly on the outside and tasty on the inside." Maxi hesitated by the kitchen entrance, taken aback by the scene unfolding before her. The sight of the half-butchered fish prompted a wave of nausea to roll through her. She quietly turned to leave. Unfortunately, Garrow happened to stretch his neck at the very moment, turning left and right until he locked eyes with her. She immediately froze in place. But the squire only grinned brightly and waved, either too ignorant or unperturbed by her visible discomfort. "Good morning, Lady Calypso." "Milady!" Ulysses glanced up from the fish in his hands and beamed, his head tilting excitedly to one side like a dog's. Maxi waved back feebly. Good morning." "You're just in time." Ulysses held up a half-butchered fish. "We caught these to thank you for the exciting tale you told us yesterday. They're the tastiest fish in all of Wedham." "We'll have them on the table in no time." Garrow returned to his task, lopping off another fish's head. Maxi stared at the severed head as it flopped onto the floor with an unceremonious slap. Its bulging eyes seemed to stare back at her in resentment, and it took all of her willpower to keep from gagging as she nodded. Again, she quickly attempted to make her escape, but Ulysses addressed her happily. "Milady, if it isn't too much of a bother, would you tell us more about the skirmish with the werewolves while you wait?" Yuli, I'm not sure she appreciates the sight of all of this blood. Garrow eyed Maxi's queasy expression uncertainly. "Don't be ridiculous. Her ladyship is brave. She watched a fountain of blood rain down from a giant ogre. The wife of the most valiant knight in the land can't possibly be squeamish." Ulysses looked at her expectantly, waiting for her to affirm his claim. Maxi swallowed against the lump in her throat and forced a smile. Thunk. Yet another fish head fell onto the ground, and she tried her best not to look. Of course, this is nothing to me." "See? Oi, one of you bring a chair for Our Lady." With that, she was trapped, forced to look on with a polite smile as a servant brought in a wooden stool. They set it down in full view of the squires while Maxi stood by, dreading the prospect of spinning a gory tale while the young men disemboweled their catch. Holding back tears, she took a shaky breath and perched herself on the edge of the seat. Meanwhile, Ulysses cut and peeled away sections of the ochre's thick skin, revealing the ivory flesh beneath. After descaling its back and belly, he carved out evenly sliced fillets and arranged them on a plate. Soon, all that remained of the fish was its skeleton. "I've seen a werewolf before." Ulysses' eyes flitted from Garrow to Maxi as he reached for another fish. "It had the fearsome head of a wolf, but its body was humanoid, and I watched as it sprang from tree to tree on its hind legs." Garrow nodded. "And their canines protrude like boar tusks. In Balto, they stuff werewolf heads and display them as trophies." "What? Why? I'll never understand Northerners and their aesthetics." "Wolves are a symbol of courage for them." More ivory fillets were added to the growing pile as the ochre began to look less like creatures and more like food. Maxi's nausea abated. She took a deep breath to regain her composure as Ulysses turned to her, drying his hands on a strip of cloth. "It's laughable that they mount werewolf heads to show off their bravery. The Red Dragon Knights slaughtered dozens of those beasts in mere moments and don't need to boast it off with stuffed heads." "Please tell us how Sir Riftan fought in that battle, milady," Garrow requested, his voice milder than his companion's. Another forced smile, another deep inhale, and Maxi began her story, starting off with how effortlessly Riftan had decapitated 3 of the beasts with a single fatal flash of his sword. From there, the tale only grew taller. As the knights advanced through the woods, dozens of the werewolves' heads fell down, thudding like hail through the forest. Her fabricated story of flesh, blood, and bone seemed to delight her young audience, and their infectious enthusiasm gradually made her forget her previous discomfort. She had never imagined herself talking so happily in front of others. Just as the story was nearing its end, the cook interrupted. "The marinade is ready, young master." "Excellent," said Ulysses. "Start grilling. I'm famished." The cook wasted no time dropping the fillets into a bowl of dark liquid. Next, he heated an oiled pan on the stove while he put together a salad of lettuce, onions, and herbs. Maxi's mouth started to water again, her appetite reinvigorated. "The ochre will be ready in just a moment, milady." The cook bowed his head towards her, placing the marinated fish on the pan. "Each bite will be grilled to golden perfection and served with this salad. It'll be nothing short of divine." As the fish began to sizzle, a wonderfully savory smell wafted through the air. Garrow, in his impatience, insisted on eating the fish fresh off the stove instead of waiting for it to be served in the dining hall. And so Maxi and the squires found themselves sitting all around a small table in the corner of the kitchen. Soon, the fresh salad and grilled ochre were set before them. Maxi sliced off a piece of steaming fish and brought it to her lips. The soft flesh, slightly sweet from the marinade, melted in her mouth and her eyes grew wide. "It's delicious!" "Of course," Ulysses grinned. "Nothing can compare to freshly caught ochre. It's one of the best things about the fall season." Though the fish was tender, the cook managed to retain its texture, and it did not have a hint of pungent odor usually associated with fresh catch. In the blink of an eye, Maxi finished 2 large fillets. Meanwhile, Ulysses and Garrow were already polishing off their 3rd serving. After helping herself to more of the crunchy salad, She served herself another slice of fish. This is one of the most amazing things I've ever tasted. Truly. We're pleased to hear that you like it. Ulysses clasped his hands above his clean plate, having been the first to devour every bite of his food. Perhaps we'll catch more for you soon, my lady. Maxi returned his smile, grateful for his kindness. I look forward to it. The flurry of activity continued over the next few days until at last the renovations were complete. Maxi and the servants gathered in the great hall for a final thorough inspection. By now, the space had transformed beyond recognition. An enormous golden chandelier illuminated the once gloomy hall. Underneath it, a striking crimson and gold carpet covered the floor. A similarly patterned rug ran up the grand staircase to the second floor, where the now lavishly appointed banquet hall could put even the royal palace's accommodations to shame. After ascending the stairs, Maxi stood awestruck at the entrance of the spacious banquet hall. Sleek marble tiles gleamed where drab stone once was, and 3 silver chandeliers shimmered between the arches of the hall's high ceiling. Is everything to your liking, milady? Aderon asked apprehensively. Maxi nodded, brushing her fingertips against the crystal windows. Sunlight streamed in through the glass, bathing the entire chamber in a warm glow. It's splendid. Seeing Aderon's face break into a satisfied grin, Maxi found herself smiling as well. Although he had been rather aggressive salesman, he was, at his core, an honest one. He had gone to great lengths to procure high-quality goods for her at reasonable prices, and he helped her hire diligent staff as well. To express her gratitude, Maxi instructed the servants to prepare a sumptuous feast for the merchant, and after indulging in their wine and the chef's specialty of roasted venison, Aderon left the castle content. Maxi and the servants saw him off, watching from the castle doors as his carriage receded into the distance. The castle is practically unrecognizable, Ruth said, descending the stairs while running a hand through his disheveled ashen hair. Riftan will no doubt be surprised when he returns. Maxi glanced over her shoulder at him. Do you think Riftan will like it? Why wouldn't he? He was the one who asked you to redecorate the place. Ruth's indifference did little to assuage Maxi's worries. As he gave an undignified yawn, her expression returned resentful. Would it hurt you to give a compliment? Oh, pardon me, your ladyship. The castle is so dazzling that I can't bear to look at it. The splendor of it all is enough to put me in a trance. Maxi glared at him, but he paid her little mind, instead stretching languidly before striding past her. Then suddenly he came to a stop as if remembering something. He turned back toward Maxi and the servants. This might be the perfect time. He pulled out a small vial from his pocket. I've just finished making the elixir for the oak tree. Would you like to test it out? That was quick. It certainly didn't feel like it to me. I was so consumed with this that I haven't been able to sleep properly for days. Despite his complaints, his unkempt appearance made it clear that he had just rolled out of bed. Maxi was again stunned by the sorcerer's brazenness, but he had lent her immeasurable aid during the renovations, so she simply nodded. Ruth turned lazily on his heel to venture out into the pavilion. He strode right up to the large leafless tree, coming to a stop under its gnarled branches. Maxi joined him and watched intensely as he uncorked the vial and poured its mysterious contents onto the exposed roots of the ancient oak. O great and merciful God of the earth, we beseech you, extend your healing hands and fill this humble servant once more with your power. Maxi rolled her eyes at Ruth's theatrical display. Hierarchs had visited her countless times throughout her childhood to heal her whenever she was left injured by her father's cruel abuse. She had seen their ministrations enough to know that mages could channel their magic through simple runes or incantations. Such lengthy and grandiose invocations were unnecessary. But when she noticed the servants looking on in awe, Maxi suddenly understood why Ruth spoke the words. He wanted to prove to them, or at the very least, convince them that he and Maxi had done their utmost to save the tree. Ruth dramatically extended his arms towards the heavens as if he were being granted some divine boon, then lowered them again and clasped his hands in prayer. Maxi covered her mouth with one hand to avoid giggling at the spectacle. Soon, however, she noticed a faint light collecting around Ruth, and she watched with amazement as the light began to coalesce into a small sphere between his hands. With the exception of the hierarch's visit, Maxi had never witnessed magic from such a close proximity. The delicate energy then flowed from Ruth's hands to the ghastly tree, enveloping it before being absorbed. Transfixed, Maxi reached out to touch the warm streams of light. The moment she made contact, it changed course and began seeping into the palm of her hand. She pulled away startled, and Ruth looked at her in surprise. "That's unexpected," he said, lowering his arms. Once the tree fully absorbed the remainder of the radiant magic, Ruth touched its trunk as if to confirm something, and then turned toward Maxi again. "It seems you have some mana affinity, milady." Mana affinity? The primary requirement for anyone who wants to practice magic. Maxi's eyes widened in surprise, and she gazed down at her hands. Did that mean she could be a mage like him? "It's only the most basic prerequisite," Ruth added casually. "The same way agile people are better suited for swordsmanship. That trait alone isn't enough to make someone a sorcerer." I see." Her shoulders slumped. Of course. How could she think for even a moment that she might be capable of such an incredible ability? Seeing her disappointment, Ruth smiled faintly. "But it is a rare talent nonetheless. You're quite full of surprises, my lady." What do you mean?" "To name a few, you're surprisingly short-tempered, prone to exaggeration, stubbornly competitive, and now it seems you're magically inclined as well." Maxi's face was flushed with embarrassment, but Ruth grinned and continued. "And here I thought you were nothing but a feeble, demure, high-born lady. You're proving to be rather interesting." That didn't sound like a compliment." "It was," Ruth said, his eyes mischievous as he gave her a smug smile. Still skeptical that any honest compliment could sound so sardonic, Maxi changed the subject, prodding the roots of the tree with the tip of her shoe. Anyway, did we succeed in reviving the tree?" "I can't say for sure." How can you not know?" Ruth shrugged. "All I did was infuse the tree with the earth's mana. We'll have to wait until spring for the results. If it sprouts leaves by then, it means the magic has worked. If not, then it's beyond saving, and you can cut it down with a clear conscience." Maxi looked up at the oak's dense tangle of brittle branches and nodded. Taking a step back, she surveyed the bleak garden and thought back to the plans that she had discussed with the groundskeeper. If the tree was still dead come spring, she intended to replace it with bright flowers and a new sapling, regardless of anyone's objection. With the renovations complete, winter preparations began in earnest at Calyp's castle. There was barely a moment for rest for the servants as they worked to cover the well with thick wooden planks, repair the partitions in the stables, and gather enough hay and firewood to last the coming winter. Inside, the maidservants washed linens until their hands swelled, scrubbing every room in the castle from top to bottom, and wove at the looms. They were tasked with assembling winter apparel for the guards before the weather became unbearably cold. Seeing the strain on everyone, Ludus approached Maxi with a cautious suggestion. "My lady, I fear that we may not be able to complete the garments on time. Would it be possible to purchase some of the fabrics instead of weaving all of it ourselves?" Maxi readily agreed, aware that everyone was overworked. How much should I order?" "About half of what we initially required. We've already prepared the rest." Maxi eyed the bolts of fabric in the corner. If she failed to calculate the exact amount, she was sure to hear an earful from the meddling sorcerer. Determined to see this done properly, she retrieved a piece of parchment to calculate just how much she would need to purchase, making sure to account for what the maidservants had already made. "Will this suffice?" She turned the page over for Ludus to see. "Yes, my lady, and if you could also procure more of the leather straps, thread, and needles." "My lady, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but we have an emergency." Maxi was not even finished jotting down Ludus's request when her gaze flicked up to the doorway. There stood Rodrigo, out of breath and clearly distressed. What is it? A man by the name of Rob Midajas is at our gate with 30 of his knights. He claims to be a Libidon nobleman, but he has no identification to prove it. Rob Midajas? Maxi frowned at the unfamiliar name. Libidon was one of Wedon's allies to the west, and it was the kingdom that Wedon interacted with the most. Despite the alliance, the nobles of Wedon did not necessarily know all of the nobles of Libidon. That was doubly true for Maxi, who had lived a cloistered life at Croyso Castle, and so she could hardly be expected to know a single one of them. She looked at Rodrigo with a sheepish expression. Did he say why he was here? Apparently he's come all this way to meet the Lord of Anatole and extend an offer of friendship. Then can't we just let him in? My lady, we can't let armed men into our land without confirming their identities first. Rodrigo's tone was unusually stern. The area surrounding Anatole is beset with monsters, so it's not uncommon for visitors to carry weapons. But they are only allowed entry if they can provide proper identification to show their family crest. It is a precaution against those who might attempt to pillage our lands while the Lord is away. The color drained from Maxi's face, and she could hear Ludus inhale sharply in fear. Maxi herself stood frozen, never having faced such a crisis. After a few moments, however, she managed to will herself to be calm. Is it necessary to be so precautious? Who would dare pillage the land under the Ramdragon's Knight's protection? We can never be sure, my lady. Ruth's voice cut through the air as he entered the room with a grim countenance. His steps swift. Everyone on the continent knows that our knights are at the capital attending the victory celebrations. It's suspicious that this Rob Midajas is visiting us while the Lord Calypso is away. Maxi felt nauseous. Do you also think that they're here to attack us? It's certainly possible. As the acclaimed hero of the Dragon campaign, Sir Riftan was allowed to keep a large portion of the treasure found in the dragon's lair. It's a tempting prize for those blinded by greed, even at the risk of crossing the Ramdragon Knights. Will we have to fight them then? If he continues to be unreasonable, we may, yes. But he has 30 knights with him. Ruth frowned, considering their odds should violence become unnecessary. If those men are real knights, they'll be difficult to deal with. Even the lowest ranking knight is capable of eliminating 10 sentries. Ruth was clearly anticipating a full-blown confrontation, the mere notion of which made Maxi's throat tighten. What would make matters significantly worse, Ruth continued, would be if this man really is a Libidonian noble. He may take offense at us refusing him entry and use his political standing to retaliate, even going so far as to start an armed conflict. The ceasefire may have stopped the war between the 7 kingdoms, but clashes among the nobility are still fairly regular. Then what should we do? What would you like to do, my lady? Ruth's eyes bored into her. Maxi flinched, her shoulders slumping under the sudden pressure. As lady of the castle, it was her duty to keep Anatole safe in Riftan's absence. She bit her lip to still her trembling jaw. I will go to the gates and try talking to him myself. I'll decide what to do after I've determined who these people are. I think that's a good idea. Ruth nodded in approval. I'll accompany you, and we should also bring the guards with us in case this escalates. Rodrigo, inform Sir Oberon and Sir Zebrik of the situation at once. Yes, sir, right away. Come with me, my lady. Without waiting for her, Ruth turned and strode from the room. Quickly, Maxi handed her a piece of parchment to Ludus and rushed after him. When she finally reached the garden, she found Ruth taking the reins of 2 horses from the stablemaster Quennel. Do you know how to ride a horse? Ruth held one set out to her. I do, she nodded, even though she had never ridden a horse this large on her own. With the help of a servant, she clambered onto the lean brown mare, gripping the reins and pressing her thighs against the saddle to keep herself from toppling over. Ruth watched for a moment, and when he was satisfied by her ability, he mounted his own horse. The guard should be waiting for us at the training grounds. Follow me. He had barely finished speaking when he spurred his horse into a gallop. Maxi followed close behind. When they passed through the castle gate, they found 30 guards standing in formation and awaiting their arrival. An elderly knight with white hair sat proudly atop his steed at the head. As Ruth approached, the knight turned his horse around. I heard some rabid bastard is causing a ruckus at the gates. The white-haired knight growled, tapping the sword fastened to his hip. This old thing was starting to miss the taste of blood. You won't be fighting them, Sir Oberon. Your task is to protect her ladyship. What? The old knight glanced over at Maxi, clearly disappointed. Maxi suppressed the urge to cower under his gaze and nudged her horse forward. Thank you, Sir Oberon. The old knight awkwardly scratched his cheek with one finger. Rest assured, my lady, you'll be safe with me here. Those troublemakers won't be a problem. With that, Sir Oberon returned to his position at the head of the formation and led the guards out of the castle. Ruth galloped after them, nodding for Maxi to follow. She trailed behind them as she crossed the drawbridge, her heart racing in time with the pounding of hooves, and her anxiety grew only stronger as she rode through the grove. It reached a point where she was trembling so badly that she had to clench her teeth to keep from biting her tongue. Maxi kept up with the guards' charge down a steep hill and through the bustling town square below, though not very confidently. She was terrified, never having ridden at such a speed before. Her hands shook as she gripped the reins tightly. Eventually, after what seemed like eons, the rampart finally came into view, and one of the sentries stationed above the gates rushed out to meet them. You're here! Ruth and Sir Oberon leaped off their horses, and Maxi dismounted soon after with the help of another guard. Where is this man who claims to be a Lividonian noble? He's just outside the gates, said the sentry. This way. This way, my lady, Ruth said, motioning for her to follow first. Maxi followed the sentry up the rampart on stiff legs. Once she was standing on the battlement, she saw 30 young men on horseback gathered beyond the wall. Their faces were tanned, and they were dressed in heavy robes with a long sword hanging at each of their waists. Ruth peered over the parapet and addressed them loudly. Which one of you is the nobleman? It is I, Rod Midahas. The haughty voice came from a man astride a chestnut horse. He appeared to be in his mid-30s, with golden brown hair and a bulky frame. He squinted up at Ruth. Are you the Lord of Anatole? I am but a mere servant. Our lady is here on the Lord's behalf. Ruth calmly gestured to Maxi with one hand. When the stranger's intense gaze fell on her, she instinctively took a step back. The corners of his lips rose into a sneer as he addressed her. It's a pleasure to meet you. I'm sure you've already I'm sure you've already been informed, but I am Rob Midahas, the Lord of Kaisa, a province in western Lebanon. I come seeking an alliance with the Rem Dragon Knights after hearing about their victory over the dragon. I hope you'll welcome me in. Maxi glanced at Ruth, but he remained impassive with his arms crossed. He obviously had no intention of humoring the unwelcomed guest, so it was up to her to sort out the situation. Trying as best as she could to loosen her rigid tongue, Maxi slowly opened her mouth to speak. I heard. You have nothing to prove your identity. I cannot allow unidentified individuals to enter. We lost them on our journey here, unfortunately. But your cleric can confirm my identity once you let us in. Anatole does not welcome unidentified guests. This is our Lord's command, and his word is law within our borders. Come back when you have new identification. Midahas furrowed his brows, and his voice grew irritated. I can't understand a word you're saying. I demand to speak with someone who can talk properly. Maxi blanched at the blatant insult, but Ruth quickly stepped forward in her defense. You're speaking to the Lady of Anatole. Mind your manners. I only spoke the truth. I can't understand her. Maxi clutched at the fabric of her skirt, fighting back the urge to flee, and mustered every ounce of her courage once more. As I've said, come back when you have some sort of identification with you. I will not open the gates until then. We passed through monster lairs to reach Anatole. You would have us weary travelers turn back without rest? The man's voice took on a menacing edge as his diplomatic facade began to crack. Maxi took a nervous step back, but her meek reaction only made him more incensed. Furious, Medahas began to shout even more loudly. Is the Lady of Anatole so uncharitable? If you deny me entry, I swear to you I will return with hundreds of knights. I won't forget this insult. Without identification, your cleric can confirm my identity. I've said that already. As Medahas grew increasingly hostile, a familiar sense of dread paralyzed Maxi, and sweat prickled at her back. Maxi began to tremble, so Ruth intervened yet again. Stop being so unreasonable. It isn't our fault you're unable to prove who you are to claim to be. Excuse me. It isn't our fault you're unable to prove you are who you claim to be. How in the blazes do you expect us to simply allow a band of armed men through our gates? Ha! Is Anatole so weak that you're afraid of letting 30 men enter? Medahas's mouth twisted into another sneer. I see now. Without your lord, Anatole is merely a den of cowards. How dare you? Sir Oberon's fury finally burst out of him, and he drew his sword in outrage. Ruth, open the gates. I'll cut off that arrogant bastard's head myself. Sir Oberon. Ruth twisted around and gave the old knight an admonishing glare, and he immediately spun back, his hands outstretched in a warding gesture. But it was too late. A massive flame hurtled towards the gate and collided with a force that shook the rampart down to its foundations. Maxi shrieked and gripped the parapet to keep her balance while the guards scrambled in confusion. Medahas unsheathed his own sword. You want my head? He called up to Sir Oberon. I'd like to see you try. Ruth grabbed Maxi by the arm and led her back down the battlement. Frantic and disoriented, Maxi barely stifled an alarmed cry when she saw that the ball of flame had demolished the gate. Shield! Ruth threw one hand out in front of him, conjuring gusts of wind that made a barrier to hold the invaders at bay. But Medahas shattered the barrier with a vicious swing of his sword. I can't hold him back, Oberon. Leave it to me. Sir Oberon leaped down from the rampart with a roar, swinging his massive sword as he charged the intruders. A cacophony of metallic clangs pierced the air. Maxi tried to run clear of the fighting, but she stumbled and was pushed to the ground by someone from behind. My lady! Ruth looked over his shoulder at her, but he was busy creating another barrier to stem the tide of enemies and could not help her. Defenseless, Maxi looked around with wide, fearful eyes. Sir Oberon and the guards were locked in fierce combat with Medahas and his knights, while a crowd of Anatolians, people who had come to the gate to see what the commotion was about, fled in terror. Then Ruth's voice cut through the chaos again. My lady, take shelter. But please, get out of here. There's nothing you can... The Remdragon Knights are here. The Lord has returned. An archer on the ramparts lowered his bow and shouted down to them. Icy silence swept across the grounds, the intruders all halting in their tracks to look behind them in disbelief. Sure enough, knights clad in silver armor thundered down the hill towards them. When Maxi saw the man leading the charge, she was overcome with pride. Her gaze fixed, unwavering, on Riftan, who exuded an effortless confidence as he galloped toward the gates of Anatole. Though they had spent only 3 weeks apart, the separation had felt like months. Riftan and his men slowed to a stop in front of the gates and appraised the black-robed Libidonian knights. Beneath his dark-winded, tousled hair, Riftan's eyes narrowed menacingly. I didn't think I'd have guests while I was away. He raised a hand and gestured for the Remdragon Knights to surround Medahas and his men, swords gleaming brilliantly under the sun. What do we call uninvited guests? Trespassers, sir. Thieves, more like. His men barked answers as they reined in their excited steeds. Maxi looked on with bated breath. The Libidonians, who had seemed so self-assured earlier, shifted uneasily. Riftan spurred his horse closer. You had the nerve to come to my land and stir up trouble. I know just the thing to have engraved on your tombstone, in memory of his boldness, foolishness, and disregard for his own life. Riftan's voice was chillingly soft. Slowly, almost leisurely, he drew his sword, and the hurriedly gesture was enough to make the assailants pale in terror. Their leader quickly lowered his weapon and addressed Riftan directly. I am Lord Ra-Midahas of Kaisa, and a nobleman of Lividon. A lord, Riftan raised an eyebrow. Encouraged by his patient response, Midahas began to speak with more confidence. Your people have offended me by questioning my identity and refusing the entry. This little misunderstanding simply got out of hand, that's all. A misunderstanding, you say. Riftan's words hung ominously on the air as he took in the destroyed gate and injured guards on the ground. Midahas grimaced. I apologize for letting my anger get the better of me. Well, why don't we end things here? I'm sure you wouldn't want things to get more unruly than they already have. This was an act of war. Riftan's calm voice sent shivers through the crowd of onlookers. He slowly approached Midahas, baring his teeth in a wolfish grin, and the Remdragon Knights parted to make way for him. You came to my gates and attacked my men. What could that mean if not war? I have every right to cut off your head, ride to your homeland, and bring it to ruin. Do you mean to break the armistice between the 7 kingdoms? Our king won't stand for such an attack. You lost its protection the moment you broke down my gate. A chill ran through Maxi's body as she wrapped her arms around herself, sensing that Riftan's collected manner was only the calm before the storm. Midahas must have realized the same, because the rest of his color drained from his face. He hastily made to retreat, but before he could move, Sir Oberon blocked his path with his blade. With the panic of a cornered rat, Midahas made another attempt to defuse the situation. I have hundreds of knights in Kaisa who are pledged to my service. If you kill me, you will truly have a war on your hands. I very much look forward to it. Riftan raised his sword. Ruth dashed towards him. Sir Riftan, you mustn't kill this man. If he really is a noble, that will be trouble. It's best to deal with him after we've confirmed his identity and sent word to Liva. Are you questioning my decision? Riftan furrowed his brow slightly, unmoved by the sorcerer's words. Ow! Well, hi. Happy? There really wasn't much left in that. That's okay. Are you questioning my decision? Riftan furrowed his brow slightly, unmoved by the sorcerer's words. A war will only bring loss. It's best to use diplomacy. We may even receive compensation for. I disagree. Riftan waved off Ruth's advice. What need is there for diplomacy? Pillaging his land is a far less complicated solution. He seemed entirely unbothered by the knights here with Midahas, or the hundreds more he would find in Kaisa. Kaisa? Ruth let out a sigh. It won't just be Kaisa. An attack of that scale would mean coming into conflict with the whole of Lividon. As he spoke, he glanced at Maxi, who had been hiding amid the guards. Think of her ladyship. You should show her the chivalry befitting a knight of your caliber. Riftan's scowl deepened, and he followed Ruth's gaze. When he saw Maxi still slumped on the ground, his eyes widened in shock, and his impassive face turned hostile. Why is my wife here? It's only natural that the Lady of Anatole would handle disputes such as these while her husband is absent. Ruth was unfazed by Riftan's quiet wrath. One moment, Riftan was gritting his teeth. The next, he was holding up the tip of his sword to Midahas' neck. Dismount your horses and surrender your weapons. Comply, and I'll allow you to keep your heads. Let me go. I'll leave at once. I'll never... You're begging for me to release you after you attacked my people? Riftan's fury reached its boiling point. No, Surrender or die where you stand. Choose. Midajas twisted around, eyes wild as he assessed the situation. His knights were completely surrounded. Realizing they stood little chance of escape, much less victory, he threw his sword to the ground and dismounted. After his men followed suit, Riftan signaled to the guards, "Bind them and throw them into the dungeons." Maxi heaved a sigh of relief, astonished that Riftan's arrival was enough to put an end to the confrontation without any more bloodshed. A guard helped her to her feet. "Are you all right, my lady? Are you hurt?" "What were you thinking?" Maxi froze, petrified in the shadow of her husband. He towered over her atop his horse, silhouetted by the sun at his back. It was difficult to make out his face like this, but she knew that he was furious. She shrank back in fear. I heard that there was a problem. And what the hell did you think you could do about it?" Maxi's blood ran cold, and she quickly lowered her head to hide her shame. Riftan had treated her with such kindness before he left, but now he spoke to her with such derision that it stole the breath from her lungs. She bit her lip and desperately tried to come up with an answer, but her mind was blank. He was right. She knew that. There was nothing she could have done to salvage the situation. Why did she even try? Riftan muttered a stream of curses, then lifted her off the ground by her waist. She yelped in surprise as he placed her in front of him on his saddle. "I'm returning to the castle first." He turned to address his knights. "Clean up this mess." And without waiting for a reply, he took off. Villagers who had gathered to watch from afar scrambled to make way, and Maxi clung for purchase on the saddle and squeezed her eyes shut. Riftan's arm around her waist tightened, and the cold edges of his armor dug into her side painfully. "He must be angry because I interfered when it wasn't my place to do so." Maxi's entire body shook. Angry men frightened her, and the thought of a man as immense as Riftan admonishing her drained the blood from her face. Violence was not the only thing she feared. The man who was so kind to her had suddenly turned cold, and her heart ached like never before. She had to suppress the urge to beg him not to hate her. When they reached the castle, Riftan dismounted and helped Maxi down. "Take my hand." She hesitantly placed her hand in his, and he lifted her off the horse. But instead of setting her down, he kept her in his arms and carried her across the garden. He ignored the servants who had rushed out to greet them, save for uttering a single icy order. "Send Talon to the stables." Riftan strode into the great hall, marching up the stairs, without sparing a single glance at the space she had spent weeks renovating. He was livid. Maxi swallowed hard and hesitantly spoke. "Riftan, please put me down." "Shut your mouth." He climbed 2 steps at a time. Though he had traveled for days in full armor, he showed no sign of fatigue and set Maxi back on her feet only after they reached the bedroom. Maxi anxiously looked up at him. Would he berate her? Strike her? She had only tried to settle a conflict as the lady of the castle. Hands clenched in her skirt, he was just about to speak when Riftan pressed his mouth to hers. Oof! Her eyes widened. A cold armored hand slid into her hair and pulled her in. Sweet chapped lips rubbed against her own, and his wet tongue slid inside the softness of her mouth. Maxi gripped Riftan's arm. She pressed tightly against his armor, and the stubble on his chin chafed her skin. When their mouths parted, she gasped for air, looking up at Riftan. He stared at her with a hardened expression as he grabbed her face with both hands. Hold on, I'm going to go refill my drink and turn on the light because it's getting dark. Alright, just a second. Everybody's trying to get a hold of me. Almost dropped my computer. Oh, nobody saw that. That's okay. Back to the story. What were you going to do if I hadn't arrived? He demanded. Maxi shuddered at the touch of cold steel on her skin. I didn't think they'd break through the gates. You shouldn't have been there in the first place, Riftan snapped. Never, ever put yourself in danger again. Do you understand? Maxi quickly nodded, which seemed to placate him. His shoulders relaxed and he let out a long sigh. After hesitating for a few moments, Maxi caressed his chin and Riftan leaned his finely shaped forehead against hers. His hair smelled faintly of grass, and Maxi wondered if he had slept in a meadow the night before. My blood ran cold when I saw you out there on the ground. Damn it. I didn't ride day and night to find you like that. I'm sorry. Riftan's tone remained stern, but the dangerous chill was gone from it. If I'd arrived just seconds later, things could have been so much worse. Damn it. I didn't mean to worry you. I'm sorry. Riftan stared at her for a moment, then began to remove his armor. After shedding his vambraces and gauntlets, he threw them to the ground, through the floor, and cupped Maxi's face in his hands. Are you hurt? He asked, examining her closely. No, I'm fine. Show me. Like a moth to a flame, Maxi's gaze was caught in the dark of Riftan's eyes. Warm, calloused hands grazed her cheeks and combed through her hair. Her breath quickened and her heart began to race. Every night that he had been away, she had curled up alone in their spacious bed, missing him terribly. I want to see with my own eyes, Riftan murmured, caressing the soft spot behind her ear. He pushed off her robe and Maxi shivered. Though she was not cold, Riftan's body radiated heat from beneath his cold armor, and it ignited a spark within her. Sweat prickled at the back of her neck. Riftan removed Maxi's hairpin, and her hair cascaded down. Tossing the pin onto the floor, he grabbed a handful of her mane and brought it to his face. A head for every scratch. What? I'll sever a head for every scratch I find on you. Such violent words, whispered in gentle tones, made Maxi shiver. But Riftan ignored her reaction and slowly slid her dress off her shoulders. His jet-black eyes roved over her from her pale collarbone to her breasts, which were still hidden under her thin chemise. Trembling like a dragonfly caught in a spider's web, Maxi was breathless with anticipation. That's one head, Riftan murmured, pointing at a small scrape on her forearm. Maxi tried to cover up the mark. This is from when I bumped into a shelf in the library. Don't lie. Excuse me. Don't lie. I'm not. Oh, Riftan grazed his mouth over her skin, sending a shiver down her spine. His lips made soft pecking noises as they moved down her arms. When he reached the spot on her wrist, where her erratic pulse quivered through her skin, he gently bit down, nibbling and sucking on her soft flesh. He lifted her off the floor and carried her to the bed. Riftan, I promise, I'm not hurt. I told you. I'll confirm that myself. He slowly lowered Maxi onto the blankets and grabbed her dress where it was bunched at her waist, pulling it off and throwing it to the floor. Stripped down to her chemise, Maxi watched nervously as Riftan knelt at the floor of the bed and lifted the hem of the chemise. His hand slid up her leg and then stopped when he discovered another scrape on her calf. This one has sealed their fate, he said darkly, rubbing his thumb over the cut. Maxi quickly tugged her chemise back down. It doesn't hurt at all. Please don't kill anyone. They not only destroyed my gate and attacked my guards, but they harmed my wife. Killing them wouldn't be enough. I'd have to make examples of their families, or this could easily happen again. But you've only just returned. She had not meant to whine, but the words escaped her lips before she could stop them. Flustered, she squeezed her eyes shut and blurted out, You would have to leave again if war broke out. Then I'd be all alone again. Damn it, Riftan muttered, pulling her toward him and kissing her with such hunger that she thought he might devour her. Maxi moaned into his mouth as he pushed her back down on the bed, her body arched into him. Riftan pulled her chemise up to her waist and stroked her hips. The chill of his armor and the searing heat of his hands, the opposing sensations flared with an intensity that made her lightheaded. Maxi clung to his shoulders, her body shaking with quick, uneven breaths as Riftan broke their kiss and licked her wet lips. The things you do to me, he said, his voice heavy with his desire. Tasting the saliva on her chin with the tip of his tongue, Riftan pulled the chemise over her head. Before Maxi could cover herself with her arms, he cupped one of her breasts in his warm, calloused hand and greedily sucked her nipple. She pulled him closer, brushing her hands over his bronze neck before combing them through his thick black hair. It was a strange feeling. She was naked under a fully armored man, allowing him to do to her as he pleased. She was powerless and powerful, lost to her hedonic desire. Unable to contain himself any longer, Riftan pulled her into a crushing embrace and kissed her once more. The warmth of his tongue intertwined with hers, and their heartbeats raced together. His cold armor pressed against her breasts, sapping the heat from her skin, and tingling sensations raced through her body, blooming heat in her ears. These past few weeks have felt like years. Riftan breathed against her mouth as he pushed his hands between her thighs. You were all I could think about. A startled cry escaped her throat, and she was torn between a desire to spread her legs open and the instinct to clamp them together. Riftan smiled and spread her legs wide open, lowering his head between them. Embarrassed, Maxi twisted her body away, but Riftan took her in his mouth without a moment of hesitation. Her thighs squeezed down on Riftan's head as if annoyed. He seized her knees, holding her legs open as he continued to caress her with his tongue. The obscenity of the act left Maxi gasping for air as she writhed in pleasure and clenched her fingers in the sheets. Heat coursed through her, simmering on the edge of release. Unable to clutch at Riftan in this position, Maxi grabbed a pillow and sank her teeth into it. An overwhelming sense of pleasure swelled in her as Riftan's tongue explored deeper. But just as she was about to reach her climax, he stopped. Maxi whimpered and rocked her hips urgently. I'll be inside you soon enough. Riftan lightly stroked her thigh, then undid his trousers, freeing his desire. Unable to contain the heat surging through her body, Maxi forgot her embarrassment and pulled Riftan closer. When he brought his hips to hers, she rubbed herself against his hardness, frantic with her need. Damn it! Riftan groaned and grabbed her hips, pressing himself briefly against her wetness before plunging into her. Maxi's legs spasmed and jerked as Riftan thrust into the deepest parts of her before swiftly slipping out. She clung to him, breathlessly desperate. Riftan let out a low moan and thrust into her again, harder this time. It was a little painful after so long without him, but Maxi needed more. A little more, just a little more. She urged him on by rocking her hips, faster and faster, and he devoured her flushed body with his dark eyes. His lips parted in pleasure, but Maxi wanted to devour him. She wrapped her legs around him and tightened herself. Surprised by her own hunger, she wanted more, every last morsel, every last scrap. As she bucked in desperation, a pained moan escaped her lips. You pushed me to the brink, Riftan breathed his fingers. You pushed me to the brink. Riftan breathed his fingers. Riftan breathed, his fingers digging into her hips as he tried his best to restrain himself. Riftan, Maxi pleaded, exasperated. She wanted him to take her with greater urgency, to embrace her like a man blinded by his desire. Without giving him any warning, she used her legs to pull him in deeper. Riftan gasped a moan, and his restraint snapped. Like a horse galloping through the fields, the silver-plated giant began to thrust wildly into her. Still, Maxi's hunger grew. She wanted to feel him deeper inside her, so she stretched her legs wide and pushed against the bed, arching her back. Not long ago, Riftan had carried her up these stairs with ease, but now his breath was heavy and labored. Maxi drowned in the sound of their bodies connecting and creaking of the bed, the rattling of his armor. Maxi. Maxi. Riftan panted, his voice breaking. He was beautiful in his longing, and Maxi caressed his face. He crushed her lips against his as their bodies came together again and again. Riftan moaned as he released himself inside of her. Maxi squeezed her eyes shut against the intensity of the climax, but it was not enough. She wanted him deeper still. She wanted him to fill her completely. Damn it, I haven't even taken off my armor. Riftan tried to get up, but Maxi impulsively clung to him when she felt him sliding out of her. Wait. Her body still throbbed with need. Maxi gazed down. He gazed down at her, his eyes dazed, and slowly pulled out. Maxi shuddered as something warm trickled between her legs. Riftan gently rubbed her thigh as if to soothe her. Just wait, he said as he loosened his cuff armor with his teeth. We're not done yet. I'll do it again. As many times as you need. No, I'm suddenly overcome with embarrassment. Maxi quickly brought her legs together. Riftan threw off his remaining armor and feasted greedily with his eyes. After dropping his breastplate, spalders, and greaves to the floor, he pulled his tunic over his head and made his way back to the bed. His broad back glimmered with sweat in the light streaming through the windows. Maxi stared, transfixed by the shape of his body and the contour of the muscles that covered him like a second armor. Come here. Riftan sat on the bed and reached for her. As Maxi hesitantly approached, he began to stimulate himself with his hand. Climb on top of me. Riftan, I know you weren't satisfied. Riftan parted her thighs and helped her straddle his lap. Embarrassed by the position, Maxi tried to get up, but Riftan held firmly to her waist. He took her breast into his mouth, nipping and sucking while grinding himself against her. Maxi clung to his shoulders and rubbed her cheek against the softness of his hair. Panting again, Riftan plunged into her. Sharp pain and pleasure coursed through Maxi as they merged, their limbs entangling like snakes. Did you miss me terribly? She gazed at him, dazed by the sensations flooding her. As their bodies began to rock against each other, faster and faster, Maxi feared that her heart would burst. Tell me you did. I miss you terribly. Maxi stammered, writhing in anticipation as their bodies melted together. Riftan clenched his teeth and began to thrust deeper. His hardness ravaged her sensitive flesh, mirroring the friction between their sweat-soaked bodies. They were pressed so close, but Maxi needed him closer still. Whimpering, she slid her arms down his back, clutching him tightly. More. She needed more. The black snake of desire coiled inside of her stomach, and she wanted to swallow Riftan whole. She wanted him to possess her, and she wanted to possess him. Maxi. Maxi. Riftan whispered, his voice shaking. Maxi gazed down at him, hardly able to believe that such a beautiful man was so enraptured by her. Tears welled in her eyes. And that's the end of chapter 6. So we will soon come back for chapter 7. All right. Ta-da! Well, we're pretty far in the book. We're about halfway through. I think there was 11 chapters. So, all right. I guess that becomes more than halfway through. Anyway, so we will come back for chapter 7 possibly tomorrow. All right. I will see you guys then.